In the rugged wilderness of Wyoming's Teton Valley, 98-year-old Margaret Maggie Reynolds was about to become the worst nightmare of a merciless criminal organization when the infamous Shadow Valley Syndicate tried to seize her fourth-generation ranch. They assumed they were dealing with just another vulnerable elderly woman. What they didn't know was that her grandson was one of the most decorated Navy SEAL commanders in modern history, with over 180 successful counter-terrorism missions across 3 continents. What began as simple intimidation would unravel one of the largest criminal enterprises in the western United States, leading to an extraordinary showdown that would transform a quiet ranching community forever. The morning frost glittered like scattered diamonds across the weathered cedar fence posts of Eagle's Rest Ranch. Maggie Reynolds stood on her wraparound porch, her weathered hands steady despite nearly a century of hard work, as she lifted her steaming coffee mug to her lips. The sun was just beginning to peek over the jagged peaks of the Tetons, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of amber and rose. Eagle's Rest had always been more than just land to the Reynolds family. Every creek, every meadow, every ancient cottonwood tree held memories stretching back to 1889, when Maggie's grandfather first staked his claim. She'd been born in the very house she still lived in, raised her children here, and now, in her twilight years, found peace in maintaining the legacy her family had built. Shadow Creek had always been a close-knit ranching community, the kind of place where neighbors helped neighbors, where a handshake meant more than any written contract, and where the biggest excitement usually came from the annual rodeo and harvest festival. But things had started changing in recent months. New faces had appeared in town, bringing with them an undercurrent of tension that Maggie recognized all too well from her long years of watching the cycles of human nature. The rumble of engines drew her attention to the gravel driveway that wound through her property. 3 black SUVs approached, their polished surfaces incongruous against the rustic backdrop of her ranch. Maggie set her coffee mug down on the porch railing, her blue eyes sharp as she watched the vehicles approach. Alexander Drake stepped out of the lead vehicle, his Italian leather shoes and tailored suit marking him as an outsider. 2 men flanked him, their casual stances betraying military training to Maggie's experienced eye. She'd seen enough soldiers in her time, including her late husband who'd served in Korea, to recognize the way they carried themselves. "Mrs. Reynolds," Drake called out, his voice carrying artificial warmth across the morning air. "Beautiful morning for a discussion about your property's future." Maggie's voice remained level, carrying the strength of someone who'd witnessed nearly a century of human nature at its best and worst. "Mr. Drake, I believe my lawyer made our position quite clear during last week's meeting. Eagle's Rest isn't for sale." Drake's smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached the porch steps. "The market is shifting, Mrs. Reynolds. Our offer is more than generous. At your age, managing a ranch this size must be quite overwhelming." "I've faced bigger challenges than smooth-talking land grabbers," Maggie replied, her gaze unwavering. "My husband and I worked this land together for 50 years. My children learned to ride their first horses in that meadow. My grandson took his first steps on these floorboards. Some things mean more than money." A shadow crossed Drake's face, his practiced charm slipping for just a moment. "Mrs. Reynolds, I don't think you fully appreciate the opportunity we're presenting. Shadow Creek is changing. Progress is inevitable. You don't want to find yourself left behind." The threat in his words hung in the crisp morning air. Behind him, his men had spread out, their casual observation of the ranch buildings anything but casual to Maggie's watchful gaze. "I understand perfectly," Maggie replied, her voice taking on a steel edge. "I understand that legitimate businessmen don't need 3 carloads of muscle to make a real estate offer. I understand that your kind of progress isn't what this valley needs." Drake stepped closer, 1 foot on the bottom porch step. "Your kind of stubborn pride can be dangerous, Mrs. Reynolds. Accidents happen on ranches all the time, especially to elderly women living alone. Maggie didn't back away. Instead, she smiled slightly, the expression making Drake pause. "You know what else I understand, Mr. Drake? I understand that you and your Shadow Valley syndicate think you can bully an old woman off her land, but you've made two serious mistakes. Is that right?" Drake's amusement carried an edge of menace. "And what mistakes would those be?" "First," Maggie said calmly, "you assumed I was alone." She nodded toward her front window, where the morning sun glinted off the scope of a hunting rifle propped visibly in its stand. "I may be old, but I'm far from helpless." Drake's men tensed, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons. "And the second mistake?" Drake asked, his voice hardening. "You assumed I wouldn't recognize what you really are." Maggie's voice carried the weight of decades of experience. "I've seen your kind before. Men who think strength comes from fear, who think they can take whatever they want. My late husband fought against men like you in Korea. My grandson fights them now." At the mention of her grandson, something flickered in Drake's eyes. "Ah yes, your grandson, the Navy SEAL. Deployed somewhere far away, isn't he? Unable to help his dear grandmother?" Maggie reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. "That's where you're wrong again, Mr. Drake. Thomas is actually expecting my call right about now." The atmosphere shifted perceptibly, Drake's men exchanging glances, their confident postures wavering slightly. "This is your final warning, Mrs. Reynolds." Drake's voice dropped to a growl. "Take our offer. Things are going to change around here one way or another. Don't make us do this the hard way." "No, Mr. Drake," Maggie's fingers hovered over her phone's keypad. "This is your final warning. Leave my property now while you still can, because if I make this call, everything changes, and not in the way you're planning." For a long moment, tension crackled through the morning air. Then Drake stepped back, adjusting his suit jacket with forced casualness. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Reynolds. Think carefully about your position, about your future." As the SUVs pulled away, Maggie watched until their dust trail disappeared down the ranch road. Only then did her hands begin to shake slightly. She looked down at her phone, at the number she'd memorized but never had to use before. Until now. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Gran, everything okay?" Maggie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Thomas, remember when you said to call if I ever needed help? If I ever felt threatened?" There was a moment of silence on the line. When Thomas spoke again, his voice had changed, taking on the hard edge of a warrior. "What happened?" The Naval Special Warfare Command briefing room in Virginia Beach fell silent as Lieutenant Commander Thomas Reynolds lowered his phone. His expression had shifted from casual attention to focused intensity in the space of a single conversation. Marcus Chen, his second in command, recognized that look immediately. It was the same one Thomas wore before every high-stakes operation. "Sir?" Commander Phillips paused his tactical briefing, noting the change in his senior operator's demeanor. "I need emergency leave effective immediately." Thomas's voice carried the quiet authority that had led men through countless combat missions. "Family situation." The word family carried special weight in the SEAL teams. No further explanation was needed. Phillips nodded once, sharply. "Granted. Chen, go with him. You've got 96 hours before we need you back for the Richardson operation." Outside the briefing room, Marcus fell into step beside Thomas. "Your grandmother? Shadow Valley Syndicate?" Thomas moved with purpose toward their office. "They're pushing her to sell the ranch, made threats this morning." He unlocked his laptop, fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. "Call Sarah Martinez at the Chronicle. She's been tracking organized crime activity in the region. See what she knows." While Marcus made the call, Thomas pulled up satellite imagery of Shadow Creek, his eyes scanning the terrain he knew from childhood. The town had changed. New buildings. On the outskirts, development pushing into what used to be open ranchland. The Shadow Valley Syndicate's compound sat just outside town limits. a sprawling complex of buildings too new and too well maintained for a simple business operation. "Martinez has intel," Marcus reported, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "Says the syndicate has been buying up property all along the valley, strong-arming locals but keeping it just legal enough to avoid serious attention." Thomas's jaw tightened as he studied the satellite images more closely. "My grandmother's ranch backs up against national forest land. High ground, clear sight lines to 3 major highways. Perfect spot for monitoring traffic." Marcus's voice carried grim understanding. "Or coordinating shipments. This isn't about real estate development." The phone on Thomas's desk rang, a secure line used only for sensitive operations. Marcus answered, his expression growing more serious with each moment. "That was my contact at the DEA," he reported after hanging up. "Shadow Valley Syndicate has been on their radar for months. They're suspected of running protection for a major drug cartel, but nothing solid enough for an indictment." Thomas closed, his laptop with decisive finality. "Then we'll have to get them something solid." The drive to Wyoming took 14 hours. They switched drivers every 3 hours, stopping only for fuel. Marcus used the time to make calls, building a clearer picture of what they were facing. The Shadow Valley Syndicate had evolved from a standard criminal operation into something more sophisticated under Alexander Drake's leadership. They'd maintained a legitimate business front, buying properties and establishing political connections. Near sunset, they passed the "Welcome to Shadow Creek" sign. The town seemed unchanged at first glance. Same rustic storefronts, same mountain backdrop. But Thomas's trained eye caught the subtle differences. New security cameras on street corners, unfamiliar faces watching from doorways, local businesses. Closing earlier than he remembered, Clara's diner still anchored the main street corner. Through the windows, Thomas could see the usual evening crowd, ranchers, shopkeepers, the regulars who'd been fixtures of town life for decades. But there was tension in their postures, conversations held in lower voices. "Your grandmother's ranch first?" Marcus asked as they approached the town limits. Thomas shook his head. "Sheriff's office. Rachel Hawkins needs to know we're here. We do this right by the book, for now." The sheriff's department occupied the same red brick building it had for 40 years. Sheriff Rachel Hawkins stood as they entered, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "Thomas Reynolds, about damn time you showed up. How bad is it, Rachel?" The sheriff's weathered face tightened. "Worse than your grandmother's letting on. Shadow Valley Syndicate has been systematically taking over the county. Small stuff at first. Protection money from businesses, controlling the local drug trade, but they're getting bolder. 2 barn fires in the last month. No proof, of course." "And the county commission?" Thomas asked, though he suspected the answer. "James. Morrison's in their pocket." Rachel's disgust was evident. "He blocks every attempt at serious investigation, claims we're harassing legitimate businessmen." Marcus studied the incident map on the wall. "You've got the pattern marked. They're moving systematically, taking control of key transport routes." Rachel nodded. "Started right after Drake bought the old Thompson property. Been expanding ever since. Your grandmother's ranch is the last piece they need to control the whole northern corridor." "Then they're not getting it." Thomas's voice carried absolute certainty. "But we need to be smart about this." Rachel's voice stopped him as they turned to leave. "These aren't your usual criminals, Thomas. Drake's people are professionals. Military. Trained, some of them. They're building something big here." "I know." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "That's why we're going to tear it down, piece by piece." The sun had set by the time they pulled up to Eagle's Rest Ranch. Lights burned in the kitchen window, and the porch lights snapped on as they approached. Maggie Reynolds stepped out, straight-backed and dignified as ever. "You made good time," she said simply. As if Thomas had just been away for the weekend instead of 3 years, Thomas hugged her carefully, noting how she felt smaller than he remembered, yet no less strong. "Brought some help." "This is Marcus Chen, my teammate." Maggie nodded to Marcus, then looked at her grandson with eyes that had seen too much trouble lately. "They'll be watching." "Drake's people? They always are these days." "Good." Thomas's smile was slight but dangerous. "Let them watch. Let them see exactly who they're dealing with." From the darkness beyond the ranch's lights, unseen observers indeed watched the reunion. In the Shadow Valley Syndicate compound, Alexander Drake received the report of Thomas Reynolds' arrival with carefully controlled anger. So the old woman called her hero grandson after all. He crushed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. "Fine. If that's how she wants to play it, we'll show them both what happens when you stand in our way." But as Drake began planning his response, he didn't notice the subtle changes already beginning in Shadow Creek. Word of Thomas Reynolds' return spread through the town's whispered conversations. Long quiet spirits began to stir, and in homes and businesses across the valley, people who'd lived too long in fear began to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally come who could stand against the darkness that had been growing in their midst. Dawn painted the mountains gold as Thomas Reynolds walked Main Street, noting changes that wouldn't be visible to casual observers. New cameras mounted on buildings, fresh paint covering old brick businesses that suddenly had money for renovations, cars with out-of-state plates parked in strategic locations. Clara's diner provided the perfect observation post. The morning crowd was sparse, conversations dying down as Thomas entered. Clara herself brought coffee, her lined face showing relief. "Wasn't sure you'd come back," Clara said quietly, sliding into the booth. "Things have changed here, Thomas. Not for the better." "Tell me." Clara glanced around before speaking. "Started small. Drake's people offering protection money. Those who refused. At accidents, break-ins, vandalism. Then the offers to buy, always above market value. How many sold?" Clara's voice carried resignation. "Too many. The Thompsons, the Reeves place, half the businesses on 3rd Street. Some were glad to take the money, others didn't see a choice." The diner's door chimed. Sarah Martinez entered, looking exactly as Thomas remembered. Sharp eyes, missing nothing, notebook always ready. She slid into the booth without invitation. "Your timing's perfect," she said without preamble. "I've got something you need to see." She spread photographs across the table, surveillance shots of the syndicate compound, documentation of late-night meetings, financial records. "They're laundering money through legitimate businesses," Maria explained. "But that's just the surface. Look at these shipping manifests. Volumes too high for what these companies claim to be moving." Thomas studied the documents. "You've been busy and careful. Had to be." Last reporter who asked questions disappeared. Officially, he took a job in Seattle. Unofficially, she left the sentence hanging. Marcus Chen entered, taking position at the counter where he could watch the street. His posture was relaxed, but Thomas recognized his combat-ready stance. "Commissioner Morrison's involved," Sarah continued. "He's been fast-tracking permits, blocking investigations. The syndicate has half the county officials in their pocket. Money trails hidden, offshore accounts, shell companies. Drake knows how to hide things, but look at these property acquisitions. They're creating a corridor." Thomas saw the pattern. His grandmother's ranch wasn't just valuable land. It was the final piece in a strategic network. The diner's door opened again. Victor Reyes, Drake's second-in-command, entered with 2 other syndicate members. The morning customers tensed visibly. Reyes approached their booth, his friendly smile not reaching his eyes. "Thomas Reynolds, heard you were back in town. Family reunion?" "Something like that." Thomas's voice was neutral, but his slight shift in position put him between Reyes and Sarah's documents. "Sweet, looking after Grandma." Reyes leaned on the table. "Hope you're not planning an extended stay, though. Town's changed. Might not be as welcoming as you remember." Clara approached, coffee pot in hand. "Everything all right here?" "Just greeting an old neighbor." Reyes straightened. "Your grandmother's stubborn, Reynolds. Stubborn people tend to have accidents. That a threat? Just an observation. Shame if anything happened to that nice ranch all alone out there." Marcus Chen chose that moment to turn from the counter, his movement deliberately drawing attention to the military-grade sidearm visible under his jacket. Reyes's smile tightened. "Just being neighborly." He adjusted his jacket. "Think about what I said." After they left, Sarah gathered her documents quickly. "They'll be watching now. More than before?" "Good." Thomas's expression was grimly satisfied. "Let them watch. Meanwhile, we'll be watching too." Across town, Maggie Reynolds received another visitor. James Morrison himself arrived in his county commissioner's car, all political charm and practiced concern. "Mrs. Reynolds, please be reasonable," he urged from her porch. "These developers bring progress, jobs. The town needs this kind of investment." Maggie's voice could have frozen summer. "Is that what they're calling extortion now? Investment?" "No one wants trouble," Morrison's tone carried warning. "But trouble has a way of finding people who don't cooperate with progress." "Interesting choice of words." Maggie smiled slightly. "My grandson used to be a history teacher before he joined the SEALs. Taught me about how corruption works, how it spreads until good people start calling it progress." Morrison's facade cracked slightly. "Your grandson needs to understand his place. This is bigger than one stubborn old woman's ranch." "Oh, I think he understands perfectly." Maggie's eyes were steel. "Question is, do you understand yours? Because when this is over, everyone will know exactly where they stood, which side they chose." After Morrison left, Maggie called Thomas. "They're getting nervous. Morrison himself came to pressure me." "We're finding interesting things," Thomas replied. "Keep the security system armed. Marcus is setting up additional cameras tonight. They're planning something," Maggie warned. "I can feel it." "I know, but so are we." At the Shadow Valley Syndicate compound, Alexander Drake received updates from his various sources. Thomas Reynolds had spent the morning gathering intelligence. The reporter was involved, and worse, others in town were beginning to take notice. "Reynolds has training," Victor Reyes warned. "Him and his friend both. This isn't some local cop we can intimidate." Drake's fist crashed onto his desk. "I don't care if he's goddamn Superman. No one threatens what we're building here. No one." He pulled up satellite images of Eagle's Rest Ranch on his computer. "If they want to play soldiers, we'll show them what real war looks like. Make the calls. It's time to bring in some professional help." In town, people noticed changes. Small ones at first. Thomas Reynolds and Marcus Chen quietly talking to business owners. Sarah Martinez openly taking photographs of syndicate activities. And most significantly, the fear that had gripped Shadow Creek began to shift because for the first time in months, someone was standing up to the Shadow Valley Syndicate. Someone was asking questions, gathering evidence, and showing no fear. Of Alexander Drake's threats, the storm was coming. Everyone could feel it, but this time when it broke, the syndicate might find themselves facing more resistance than they'd bargained for. Because Thomas Reynolds hadn't just come home to protect his grandmother's ranch, he'd come to take back his town. Black SUVs with tinted windows began appearing in Shadow Creek. They moved with military precision, their drivers too professional to be ordinary thugs. Marcus Chen noticed them first, his combat experience recognizing the telltale signs of private military contractors. Ex-military, he told Thomas, watching a pair of them case Main Street. Probably Blackwater alumni or similar. Drake's bringing in serious muscle. Thomas observed their movements from Clara's diner. 4 teams that I've counted. They're setting up surveillance posts around town. Sarah Martinez slipped into their booth, her voice low. "Got something." Police scanner caught chatter about shipments coming through the old logging roads. Deputy Wilson's been redirecting patrols away from those areas. Wilson's one of theirs. Sarah's expression darkened, along with 3 other deputies. Sheriff, Hawkins has been isolated, her most trusted officers reassigned to desk duty. The diner's regular customers were leaving larger tips than usual. Silent support for Clara's willingness to let Thomas use the place as an observation post. Small gestures of resistance were spreading through town. Jenny Parker had refused to sell her store, despite escalating pressure. Mike Wilson's garage had started offering free repairs to anyone the syndicate had vandalized. The bell above the diner's door chimed. Alexander Drake himself entered. Flanked by 2 of his new professionals, the morning crowd fell silent. Drake slid into Thomas's booth uninvited, his expensive suit out of place in the rustic diner. Reynolds, we should talk. Nothing to talk about. Actually, there is. Drake's smile was cold. See, you're interfering with business. Legitimate business, making my investors nervous. Legitimate? Thomas's eyebrow raised. That why you need military contractors to protect your investment? Drake's facade cracked slightly. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This is bigger than your grandmother's stubborn pride. Bigger than this whole backwoods town. That's where you're wrong. Thomas met his gaze steadily. This town isn't backwards. It's just been waiting for someone to stand up to thugs like you. Careful, Reynolds. Drake's voice dropped dangerously. Heroes have a way of getting hurt. Sometimes their families too. Marcus Chen chose that moment to approach, casual but purposeful. Drake's professionals tensed, hands moving beneath. Their jackets. Everything okay here, Thomas? Before Drake could respond, Sheriff Rachel Hawkins entered the diner. Her expression hardened at seeing Drake, but her voice remained professional. Mr. Drake, just the man I wanted to see. We've got some irregularities in your building permits to discuss. Drake stood smoothly. Another time, Sheriff. I was just leaving. He turned back to Thomas. Think about what I said. Family should come first. After they left, Rachel joined their booth. 4 of my deputies are on their payroll. Just got proof. Bank records show regular payments through shell companies. Can you arrest them? Sarah asked. Rachel shook her head. Not without exposing our investigation. Besides, Commissioner Morrison would have them released within hours. We need to let them think they're winning. Sarah nodded toward the window. They're setting up surveillance on your grandmother's ranch. Professional teams rotating shifts. Good. Thomas's smile was grim. While they're watching us, they won't notice what we're really doing. At Eagle's Rest Ranch, Maggie received visitors of a different kind. Jenny Parker arrived with fresh-baked goods. Mike Wilson came to check her tractor, leaving behind a sophisticated security system. Clara's husband brought dinner and news about which local officials were in Drake's pocket. The syndicate's mercenaries noticed this quiet parade of support. Drake's professionals photographed every visitor, logged every interaction, but they missed the subtle exchanges, the small packages passed, the quiet conversations that were building a network of resistance. In the sheriff's office, Rachel Hawkins met secretly with Thomas and Marcus after hours, got something interesting from state police. Syndicate's been buying properties along 3 major trucking routes, all through shell companies, all traced back to offshore accounts. Drug corridors, Marcus confirmed. They're setting up a distribution network. Your grandmother's ranch would give them a clear route straight through to Canada, and surveillance positions overlooking every major approach, Thomas added. They're building something big. Sarah Martinez arrived through the back door, carrying files. Found records of similar operations in Colorado and Utah. Same pattern. They move in, buy key properties, corrupt local officials. Within 6 months, drug traffic in the area triples, but they made a mistake here. What's that? They thought they could intimidate an old woman off her land, Thomas said quietly. Instead, they've given us the opening we need to bring down their whole operation. A crackle of static from Rachel's radio interrupted them. multiple vehicles approaching the Reynolds ranch. Armed subjects observed. Thomas was already moving. They're making their play sooner than expected. Be careful, Rachel warned. Drake's professionals won't hesitate to use lethal force. Neither will we. Marcus's voice was cold. They wanted to play soldiers. Let's show them what real soldiers can do. As they drove toward the ranch, Marcus monitored radio traffic. The syndicate was mobilizing in force, their mercenaries taking up tactical positions around the property. But what they didn't know was that Thomas had spent the last 3 days preparing for exactly this scenario. Eagle's Rest Ranch was no longer just a peaceful homestead. It was a trap, and the syndicate was about to spring it. Night had fallen over Shadow Creek when the syndicate made their move. 6 vehicles approached with lights off, using the rolling terrain for cover. Their mercenaries deployed with professional precision, establishing a perimeter around the property. From their perspective, it looked like a straightforward intimidation operation. They were wrong. In the main house, Maggie Reynolds sat calmly at her kitchen table, sipping chamomile tea. The lights were on, making her a clear silhouette in the window, exactly as planned. Through her earpiece, she could hear Thomas's quiet voice coordinating their response. Just like we discussed, Gran, let them think they have the advantage. The first sign that something was wrong came when the mercenaries' radio communications suddenly filled with static. Marcus Chen had spent 2 days setting up interference equipment hidden in old farm machinery around the property. Communications compromised, one of the professionals reported, switching to hand signals. They maintained their approach, but with noticeably more caution. The second surprise came from the town. Trucks began arriving. Mike Wilson's tow truck, Clara's delivery van, a half-dozen local vehicles driven by men and women who'd finally had enough of living in fear. They parked along the access road, blocking the syndicate's escape route. What the hell is this? Victor Reyes demanded, watching through binoculars from the command vehicle. The mercenaries' neat tactical formation was suddenly compromised, forced to split their attention. Thomas's voice came clearly over their interrupted radio frequencies. This is private property. You have 10 seconds to withdraw. Drake's voice crackled with rage as he grabbed the radio. Reynolds, you're making a big mistake. Clear these vehicles or we'll clear them ourselves. Last warning, Thomas replied calmly. Leave now. 2 mercenaries advanced on the ranch's main gate. The moment they touched it, lights blazed to life, powerful flood lamps mounted on the barn, and outbuildings turned night into day. The professionals found themselves illuminated, their positions exposed. Sniper teams, you have targets? Drake demanded. Silence answered him. His sniper teams, positioned in the hills overlooking the ranch, had found their scopes mysteriously painted over. The work of local hunters who knew every trail and approach to the property. Sheriff Rachel Hawkins's voice cut through the chaos. This is the police. I'm receiving reports of armed individuals threatening civilians. All units respond. Drake recognized the trap too late. If his men engaged now, they'd be doing it in front of witnesses, with police en route. His carefully maintained facade of legitimate business would crumble. Pull back, he ordered through gritted teeth. Tactical withdrawal. Now. The mercenaries began retreating, their professional demeanor cracking as locals used phones to film their every move. Sarah Martinez was there too, documenting everything, but the syndicate had one last card to play. As the main force withdrew, 2 men broke from the group, rushing toward the barn with Molotov cocktails. They never made it. Marcus emerged from the shadows, his military training evident in every movement. One precise strike disarmed the first man. The second found himself facing Thomas Reynolds, who seemed to materialize from nowhere. The fight was brief, controlled, and decisive. Both attackers were subdued without a single shot fired, zip-tied, and left for the approaching police. When the police arrived, they found a curious scene. Armed mercenaries in retreat, their tactical. Operation disrupted by simple preparation and community action. 2 would-be arsonists in custody, and dozens of witnesses with video evidence of the entire attempt. Drake watched his plans unravel from his command vehicle, fury building. "This isn't over, Reynolds," he shouted into the radio. "Actually, it is," Thomas replied. "You just gave us probable cause to investigate every vehicle and individual involved in tonight's attempt." Sheriff Rachel Hawkins's voice held satisfaction. "Already got the warrants. Judge Henderson was happy to sign them after seeing the evidence of attempted assault and arson. The search of the syndicate's vehicles revealed more than they'd intended. Police found military-grade weapons, communications equipment, and most damaging of all, detailed maps of drug trafficking routes through the county." In the farmhouse, Maggie finally set down her teacup. Well, that was exciting. Thomas entered, checking her over, despite knowing she'd been perfectly safe. "You okay, Gran?" "Of course," she smiled slightly, "though I suspect we've just stirred up a hornet's nest." That was the plan. Thomas watched through the window as police processed the scene. They had to show their hand eventually. "Now we have proof of their real operations." Marcus joined them, his expression serious. "Found something in their vehicles. Documentation linking them to cartel operations in 3 states. Drake's operation is bigger than we thought." "Good." Thomas's voice was grim. "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." At the Shadow Valley Syndicate compound, Alexander Drake was discovering just how badly the night's operation had gone wrong. His phone rang, a secure line used only for emergencies. "You assured us the situation was under control," the cartel representative's voice was cold. "Now we have police searching vehicles containing sensitive information. This is unacceptable." "I'll handle it," Drake promised, sweat beading on his forehead. "You'd better. You have 24 hours to clean this up. After that, we'll send someone to handle it our way." "I can handle Reynolds," Drake insisted. "We've got leverage now. Look." He opened a folder containing classified military documents, details of Thomas's SEAL operations, mission reports, names of team members. "Our source came through. SEAL. Team was involved in some controversial operations. One leaked to the right media outlets." Garcia cut him off. "You don't understand. The cartel doesn't want exposure, any exposure. Fix this or we'll fix it ourselves." As the meeting ended, Marcus's surveillance equipment captured every word. He and Thomas listened from their hidden observation post near the compound. "They're going to move against us soon," Marcus noted. "Drake's lost control. The cartel won't trust him much longer." "Good." Thomas checked his watch. "Sarah's story about the corrupt deputies breaks tomorrow. Rachel's got enough evidence to force an internal investigation." "They'll try to stop the story. Counting on it. Sometimes you have to let the enemy think they're winning." Back at Eagle's Rest Ranch, Maggie sat on her porch, watching police cars periodically drive past. The surveillance was obvious now, intimidation replacing subtlety. Her phone rang. James Morrison, the corrupt commissioner. "Mrs. Reynolds." His voice oozed false concern. "The county board is very worried about these violations on your property, but there might be a way to resolve everything quickly." "Save your breath, Mr. Morrison," Maggie interrupted. "Better start worrying about yourself. I understand the FBI takes a dim view of officials who help drug traffickers." Morrison's facade cracked. You have no idea what you're dealing with, you stubborn old woman. None of you do." "Actually," Maggie smiled slightly, "I don't think you know what you're dealing with, but you're about to find out." As night fell, tension gripped Shadow Creek. The syndicate's political pressure had revealed the depth of their corruption, but also its limits. Every act of intimidation sparked new resistance. Every threat exposed new weaknesses. In the darkness, a convoy of unmarked vehicles crossed the county line, heading toward town. The cartel was done waiting. They were sending professionals to eliminate the problem permanently. But Thomas Reynolds had spent his career dealing with professionals. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The war for Shadow Creek was about to enter a new phase, and the enemy was about to learn that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a gun or a badge. It's the truth itself. The Shadow Creek Chronicles. Headline hit like a thunderbolt. Corruption in uniform. Deputies' secret payoffs exposed. Sarah Martinez's article detailed every corrupt transaction, every compromised investigation, complete with bank records and witness statements. By sunrise, the story had spread through town like wildfire. Deputy Wilson's rage manifested in a kicked-in door at the newspaper office. He found it empty. Sarah had anticipated this reaction, working remotely from a secured location. But the violence marked a turning point. The syndicate's facade of legitimacy was cracking. At the sheriff's department, Rachel Hawkins moved quickly. Paul, take a team. Arrest Wilson and Morris. The evidence is solid now. But Wilson had disappeared along with 3 other implicated deputies. Their patrol cars were found abandoned at the Shadow Valley Syndicate compound. Thomas and Marcus monitored the situation from their observation post. They're consolidating, Marcus noted, watching through high-powered optics. Bringing their compromised assets in for protection. More than that, Thomas replied. Look at the new arrivals. 3 unmarked vans had entered the compound. Men emerged with military precision, carrying equipment cases. Not local muscle. These were professional. Killers, cartel cleaners, Marcus confirmed. Garcia's not waiting for Drake to fix this anymore. In town, the morning brought escalation. Jenny Parker arrived at her store to find the windows smashed, but her customers formed a human chain, helping clean up and maintain business as usual. Mike Wilson's garage became a staging area for impromptu security patrols by local veterans. Clara's diner remained the nerve center of resistance. They hit 4 businesses overnight, Clara reported to Thomas. But something's changed. People aren't backing down anymore. The police scanner crackled with reports of armed men conducting inspections of businesses that had supported Eagle's Rest Ranch. But these weren't Drake's usual thugs. They moved with professional efficiency, leaving subtle but clear threats. Maggie Reynolds' morning began with a visit from James Morrison and 2 state police officers. We have a warrant to search the property, Morrison announced, waving papers. Environmental violations. Step aside. Maggie stood in her doorway, unmoved. Interesting. The warrant signed by Judge Henderson, who I just got off the phone with. He never saw these papers. Morrison's face twisted. Mrs. Reynolds, don't make this difficult. Oh, it's already difficult, Maggie interrupted. For you. Because while you were trying to intimidate an old woman, you didn't notice the FBI surveillance. Team photographing this entire attempt at illegal entry. As if on cue, an unmarked federal vehicle rolled into view. Morrison's police escorts, recognizing real federal agents, quickly withdrew. This isn't over, Morrison snarled. You're right about that, Maggie agreed calmly. The FBI is very interested in corrupt officials using fake warrants to help drug traffickers. Across town, the cartel's professional killers began their work. Sarah Martinez's car exploded when she turned the key, but she wasn't in it. Thomas's warning had come just in time. Clara's diner suffered a mysterious gas leak, except she'd already evacuated on Marcus's advice. Each attempted hit failed, met with empty targets and prepared responses. The hunters were becoming the hunted. At the Shadow Valley Syndicate compound, frustration boiled over. How are they anticipating every move? Garcia demanded. Drake had no answer. His organization was coming apart. 3 of his lieutenants had already disappeared with significant cash. Others were making quiet deals with law enforcement. Find Reynolds, Garcia ordered. Find him and end this. Now. But Thomas Reynolds was done hiding. He walked straight into the Mountain View Hotel's lobby, passing Garcia's security as if they didn't exist. In the restaurant, he sat down across from the cartel representative. "Bold move," Garcia commented, signaling his men to hold position. "Just delivering a message," Thomas replied. "Every piece of evidence we have, every document, every recording, it all gets released to federal authorities if anything happens. To anyone in this town, you're playing a dangerous game." "No game," Thomas's voice was steel. "You've got bigger problems coming. Drake's been skimming from your shipments, selling routes to your competitors. We've got proof of that too." Garcia's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on his water glass. "That's a serious accusation. Check your books. Check your missing shipments. Drake's been playing both sides, using your money to build his own empire." Thomas stood. To leave, Garcia's men tensed, but their boss waved them down. "If you're lying, Reynolds, you know I'm not. Drake's a liability now. The question is, how many of your operations will he expose when he falls?" The impact of Thomas's revelations spread through the cartel's hierarchy like poison. Drake had no idea that his own allies were now his greatest threat. At Eagle's Rest Ranch, Maggie received another visitor, Victor Reyes, Drake's second in command. But something was different about this visit. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder, "there are some things you need to know about Drake's real plans, about who's really behind all this." Inside the farmhouse, Reyes spread documents across her kitchen table, evidence of something far bigger than a local drug operation, something that reached into the highest levels of state government. "Drake's just a middle manager," Reyes explained. "The real power, it goes all the way to the capital." The truth was bigger and uglier than anyone had imagined. The Shadow Valley Syndicate wasn't just a gang. They were pawns in a massive criminal enterprise that used Wyoming's open spaces for international drug trafficking. And now, with pressure building from all sides, that enterprise was about to explode into violence that would change Shadow Creek forever. Because the cartel wasn't just sending killers now, they were sending an army. And the war for the soul of a small Wyoming town was about to become something much more dangerous. The only question was who would survive when all the masks finally came off. Victor Reyes's documents exposed a network of corruption that stretched from Shadow Creek to the state capital. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and compromised officials created a web that had turned Wyoming's remote highways into drug corridors worth millions. The syndicate was just the muscle, Reyes explained, his hands shaking as he laid out more evidence. Drake thought he was building his own empire, but we were always just tools for bigger players. Maggie studied the documents with steady eyes. "Why come forward now?" "Because they're cleaning house." Reyes's fear was evident. "The cartel's eliminating everyone who knows too much. Drake doesn't realize he's already dead. So are the rest of us." Before Reyes could continue, shots shattered the kitchen window. Maggie and Reyes hit the floor as bullets tore through the space where they'd been sitting. Marcus's voice crackled over Maggie's concealed radio. "Hostile team neutralized. You're clear, but we need to move." Thomas arrived moments later, moving with combat-trained precision. Two-man sniper team, cartel professionals. Marcus has them zip-tied for Rachel. In town, the violence escalated. James Morrison's car exploded outside the county offices. The corrupt commissioner survived, but the message was clear. The cartel was severing loose ends. Sheriff Rachel Hawkins faced her own crisis. Her remaining corrupt deputies had barricaded themselves in the evidence room, destroying documents. "Let them burn their copies," she told her trusted officers. "All the real evidence is already safe. They're just proving their guilt." Sarah Martinez broadcast live from a secured location, revealing document after document. State officials had accepted millions in bribes to ignore suspicious property purchases. Highway patrol routes were altered to leave drug corridors unmonitored. The syndicate was given free rein to intimidate and control local communities. The Shadow Valley Syndicate compound descended into chaos. Alexander Drake found himself trapped between the cartel's cleaners and his own fracturing organization. 3 of his lieutenants were found dead in their homes. Others disappeared with cash and evidence, running for their lives. "It's over, Drake." Victor Reyes's voice came through his phone. "I've given them everything. The only way any of us survive is to come clean." Drake's response was predictable. He ordered his remaining loyal men to hunt down Reyes, but his authority was crumbling. Each order was questioned, each command met with hesitation. At Clara's diner, the community gathered in defiance of the growing danger. Local veterans established security patrols. Business owners shared resources and information. The atmosphere was tense but determined. "They thought they could break us one by one," Clara told the crowded diner. "Instead, they united us." Thomas and Marcus coordinated protection details from their makeshift command center. "The cartel is moving fast now," Marcus reported. 3 more hit teams identified entering the county. "Let them come," Thomas replied. "Every move they make gives us more evidence. Rachel's got federal task forces standing by. We just need to prove the connection to state officials." The proof came from an unexpected source. James Morrison, wounded and terrified after the attempt on his life, arrived at the sheriff's department ready to talk. "I'll tell you everything," he babbled. "Names, dates, recordings, just keep me alive." But the cartel had anticipated this. As Morrison began his confession, power to the sheriff's department was cut. In the momentary darkness, shots were fired with surgical precision. Rachel Hawkins's quick thinking saved Morrison's life, but the message was clear. The cartel would eliminate every threat, no matter how well protected. Eagles Rest Ranch, now guarded by a volunteer force of local veterans and trusted deputies, received the news grimly. "They're getting desperate," Maggie observed. "Desperate is dangerous," Thomas agreed, "but it's also sloppy. Every attack exposes more of their operation." Sarah Martinez's broadcast continued, revealing more documents. The syndicate's property purchases weren't random. They were creating a network of safe houses and monitoring posts along major trafficking routes. But the real money didn't come from drugs. It came from selling information about federal law enforcement operations to multiple cartels. The revelation exploded through criminal networks like a bomb. Drake had been playing different cartels against each other, selling tactical information to the highest bidders. Garcia, the cartel representative, received orders from his superiors: eliminate Drake and every member of his organization. Leave no traces, no witnesses. But as night fell over Shadow Creek, the cartel's hit teams found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Local veterans who knew every back road and hunting trail. Farmers who could spot strangers from miles away. A community that had decided to stop being victims. Drake, realizing his position was untenable, made one last desperate move. "If I'm going down," he told his remaining loyal men, "I'm taking this whole town with me." He didn't realize that his words were being recorded, transmitted to multiple secure locations, evidence that would ensure there was no turning back. The war for Shadow Creek had moved beyond threats and intimidation. Now it was about survival, and in the coming hours, everyone would have to choose a side, because the next sunrise would bring either liberation or destruction. There was no middle ground left. Alexander Drake's desperation manifested in flames. 3 police vehicles burned outside the sheriff's department, a distraction while his men attempted to destroy the remaining evidence inside. But Rachel Hawkins had anticipated this, moving all crucial documents to secure locations days earlier. "They're getting sloppy," Rachel told Thomas over a secured line. "Drake's losing control of his own people. Half of them are running, the other half are turning on each other." Outside Clara's diner, the first real gunfight erupted when cartel hitmen attempted to eliminate Victor Reyes. They found themselves facing Thomas and Marcus's prepared defenses, local veterans who knew every vantage point in town. Contact front. Marcus's voice crackled over their tactical radio. Two teams, professional shooters, moving toward the diner. The hitmen's precision was nullified by their unfamiliarity with the terrain. They didn't expect return fire from the grain elevator, where Mike Wilson and two other veterans had established an observation post. They weren't prepared for the local knowledge that turned every alley and rooftop into a defensive position. "This isn't a cartel hit anymore," Thomas observed, watching through his scope as the attackers retreated. "They're desperate, making mistakes." At Eagle's Rest Ranch, Maggie received warning of approaching vehicles, but instead of attackers, she found 3 families from town seeking shelter. "The syndicate is burning people out," Jenny Parker explained, helping her elderly mother from the car. "Anyone they think might testify against them." Maggie's response was immediate. "Clara's sending food. We've got space in the barn if we need it. Nobody in this town stands alone anymore." Sarah Martinez broadcast what would be her final report. Before going into protective custody, state law enforcement has been compromised at the highest levels. Federal agents are en route, but local officials warn of an imminent escalation of violence. Drake watched the broadcast from his compound, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. 3 more of his lieutenants had been found dead, executed by cartel hitmen. Others had fled, taking evidence with them as insurance. "Sir," one of his remaining men reported, "Garcia's people are moving into position around the compound. They're going to hit us tonight." Drake's laugh held an edge of madness. "They think they can just clean up their mess, eliminate all traces." He moved to a wall safe, removing a hard drive. "I've got insurance. Every operation, every corrupt official, every cartel connection, all backed up and ready to release to federal authorities." "That's your plan?" Victor Reyes' voice came from the doorway. He had slipped in during the chaos, his weapon trained on Drake. "More blackmail?" Drake's smile was cruel. "Come to beg for your life?" "No. Came to show you something." Reyes nodded. Toward the window. Outside, vehicles were approaching the compound. Not cartel hit teams, police cars, federal agents, and most significantly, local trucks and cars forming a perimeter. The community had surrounded them. Drake's phone rang. Thomas Reynolds' voice came through clearly. "It's over, Drake. Your cartel friends are being rounded up statewide. The evidence is already with federal prosecutors. Surrender now while you can." "You think I'm finished?" Drake's voice rose hysterically. "I've still got leverage. One call and every piece of evidence I have goes public. The cartels, the corrupt officials, they'll all burn with me." "Check your phone," Thomas replied calmly. "Check what's being broadcast right now." Drake's screen showed Sarah Martinez's final broadcast, but now she was revealing documents. His documents. The evidence he'd thought was safely backed up. "How?" Drake's composure cracked. "You never knew who really wrote your security protocols, did you?" Thomas's voice held grim satisfaction. Marcus Chen didn't just train with SEALs. He was naval intelligence. Every file you thought was encrypted was being copied. Every backup you made was compromised. Drake ran to his safe, but he already knew the hard drive would be blank. His insurance policy was now evidence in federal hands. The compound erupted into chaos. Cartel hitmen, realizing their mission was compromised, began eliminating loose ends. Drake's remaining men turned on each other, some trying to surrender, others fighting to escape. In town, the community's solidarity had turned the tide. Every cartel hit team found themselves trapped between law enforcement and armed citizens protecting their town. The professional killer's advantage in training meant nothing against locals who knew every back road and hiding spot. Rachel Hawkins coordinated with federal tactical teams using information from Reyes and other cooperating witnesses to round up corrupt officials. State police units loyal to the cartel found themselves facing fellow officers who'd chosen to stand against corruption. At Eagle's Rest Ranch, Maggie watched federal helicopters approach the Shadow Valley Syndicate compound. "Jack," she said over their secure line, "Drake's got one more card to play, the tunnels." "What tunnels?" "The old mining tunnels under the compound. Reyes told me about them. They lead all the way to the state forest." Thomas's curse was eloquent. "Marcus, coordinate with tactical teams. Drake's got an escape route we didn't know about." But Drake's final desperate move was already in motion. The explosion started small, drawing attention to the front of the compound. By the time anyone realized the real threat, Drake and his core group had vanished underground. "Let him run," Rachel advised. "We've got the evidence. He's finished." "No," Thomas's voice was hard, "because he's not running to escape. Those tunnels lead within half a mile of the ranch. This isn't about getting away. It's about revenge." Maggie Reynolds stood on her porch, watching the compound burn in the distance. Around her, the community had gathered, armed, ready, and done with being afraid. Drake was coming, but this time he wasn't facing a helpless old woman. He was facing a town that had found its strength, its unity, and its courage. The night was about to become very dangerous. But for the first time, the people of Shadow Creek weren't afraid of the dark. They were ready for it. Thunder rolled across Shadow Creek as Drake emerged from the tunnel onto Eagle's Rest Ranch. But instead of finding an easy target for his revenge, he faced the combined strength of an entire community. Local veterans had established defensive positions. Federal agents surrounded the area. And on the porch stood Maggie Reynolds, as unshakable as the mountains themselves. "It's over, Drake," she said simply. "Your empire's finished. Your allies have abandoned you. All that's left is to decide how this ends." Drake raised his weapon, desperation making him dangerous. "You think you've won? You've destroyed everything I built." "No," Maggie's voice was firm. "You destroyed it yourself. With every person you threatened, every life you ruined, every bit of corruption you spread. We just showed everyone the truth." Federal agents moved in, led by Thomas and Marcus. Drake's remaining men surrendered, seeing the futility of further resistance. But Drake himself made one final fatal mistake. As he turned his weapon toward Maggie, multiple shots rang out, not just from law enforcement, but from townspeople protecting one of their own. In the aftermath, Shadow Creek began to heal. The Shadow Valley Syndicate's network was dismantled. Corrupt officials faced justice. The cartel's operation in Wyoming was shut down completely. Eagle's Rest Ranch flourished under Maggie's continued stewardship, becoming a symbol of resilience and community strength. Thomas and Marcus stayed on, helping establish new security protocols for rural communities facing similar threats. Sarah Martinez won a national award for her reporting. Rachel Hawkins rebuilt her department with a focus on community trust and transparency. And the people of Shadow Creek discovered that their greatest strength had always been each other. 6 months later, Maggie sat on her porch with Thomas, watching another Wyoming sunset paint the sky. "You know what Drake never understood," she mused. "He thought power came from fear and money, but real power comes from people standing together, doing what's right no matter the cost." Thomas smiled. "He also never understood something else, Gran." "What's that?" "Never threaten a 98-year-old woman who spent her whole life standing up to bullies. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that courage and community can overcome any threat, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring you powerful, true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of adversity. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in justice, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of American determination. Tomorrow, we've got another incredible story waiting for you. that you won't want to miss.